I would never want to say that because we've figured out some chokhmah for how something helps or works, that places limits on how Kadosh Baruch Hu operates. And in fact, I think, the way the world behaves is always partly what we expect and what we can understand and make sense of, and partly not. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu always has unlimited freedom to have part of what happens be to remain a mystery to us for how it happened. And Kriyat Yam Suf is partly about that, where it plays with the idea that, oh, maybe you could make sense of this, or maybe that's not the point. And clearly there is an appropriate reading of it, where it is the sort of Prince of Egypt version, not because that's quote unquote actually what happened or the only thing that could have happened, but because anyone who sort of makes a portrayal or an argument for the Prince of Egypt version, where it's like walls of water like elevator doors opening up, no one can say that's beyond Hashem to do that if he wants, right? Like you can say, we think that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't like to do that, usually, or it takes great zchut on the part of those who experience, nes galui like that to merit it. And maybe you could argue, there's like these psukim in Psukei Zimra, like Chok Natan velo ya'avor, where there's maybe some notion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lo ya'avor may be referring to Hashem, like he doesn't want to break a law that he made, in the manner that I've argued about Achashverosh not wanting to rescind his orders. So it might be that you could say HaKadosh Baruch Hu has so cleverly devised his laws of nature that he can, his unlimited freedom to express his will within the framework of those natural laws, but we just don't understand it completely or whatever. But I think it's like this philosophical game that doesn't need to be thrashed out so much, because the practical difference between what we don't understand or don't have the ability to measure about what's natural versus what Hashem does that seems to be to us to be some kind of violation of what's natural, that there is no practical difference there. And so I would say that I absolutely agree that there is a useful and meaningful sense in which you can read that passage about Shlomo, or a variety of other ones, and just say, we as Ovdei Hashem should be understanding the terms of the Brit with Hashem and not thinking about how's he going to do it, and like, can I beat the house by understanding the science of how he's going to do it and sort of sidestepping that. You can't beat the house. This is like those Baruch who you're talking about. So if he says that if you, don't keep the laws of Shemitah, then the land will vomit you out, and the land will rest for all the years of Shemitah that you didn't keep it. Yes, I do think there is a chokhmah to understanding why that it has a sensible mechanism on the one hand, and on the other hand, anything that I make up about that is irrelevant in some sense. This is Hashem's promise. He will fulfill his promise, and it doesn't matter whether we understand how he gets it done. We sometimes will, we sometimes won't. But I think the operative point is that in an era where everyone is obsessed with chokhmah, and nothing is true unless there's a chokhmah to it, and also in an era where Am Yisrael are stepping back into this role of possibly leading the world in how to understand what the world is and what our job in it is, right? Because we've been, scattered for millennia, but now this principle of Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Adonai Yerushalayim can be resurrected. There is, from the Torah, a proof text for the idea that from the perspective of the rest of the world looking at us and trying to understand how do we learn from Mamlechet Kohanim, how to run our societies, there has to be a chokhmah for their seeing how HaKadosh Baruch Hu's brachot arise from our keeping of the Torah, so that they can start to understand principles of how to design their own societies. And that's like black on white in Sefer Dvarim. So I think it's an important thing to thrash out, But I absolutely agree that at the end of the day, I don't know if I would call it mystical, but I would call it mysterious or incomprehensible or not constrained by our notion of what's natural. Those kinds of things can certainly apply to how HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses to get the job done whenever he wants.
I would also I have to admit that, I mean, this is not a reason to do it. This doesn't prove truth, but I have to admit that when people take a Rav Chaim evolution Nefesh HaChaim type approach, which is that any little mitzvah we do have these incredible sort of earth-shattering, but that's not even the right word, universe-shaking type of effect, that's a very big motivator for doing mitzvot. And that's been a big motivator. And that's why some people, when you take away if you want, again, it doesn't have to be called mystical, but if that framework is taken away, for some people, is the removal of a major motivator. Now, I'm not, again, if it's not true, then even if it's a motivator, well, it can be stated that it's not true. But in connection to what I said, it may well be that if we imagine, again, removing the word, we don't need the word mystical, but if we imagine there's some mysterious effect to what we're doing beyond any of the overt things that you were describing in the last video, then there is something, for lack of a better, motivating or comforting or heartwarming about that.
No, yeah. Well, so that's an interesting point of discussion. If we were to try to have a long conversation about the attractions of mysticism, the best arguments in favor of it as a practical tool, and the dangers of trying to derive a benefit from it, and what is the alternative? What would I argue is the alternative that Torah actually recommends? Because I totally agree with the principle that any mitzvah or any action that we take can have consequences we don't appreciate, and we should treat them as such, meaning that we should not imagine that our intellect can comprehend the weight of what we do. This is the inverse of the point about the serpent's fangs, like that we were making a last shiur. The same way that, when we committed Avera, we might say, well, I've looked at this from every angle and I don't really see what the issue is, right? Like, what am I doing to the world by transgressing in this way? It seems like it doesn't hurt anyone. There seems like there can't really be a problem with it. And then what the Torah shows us with the serpent, the idea of the serpent, is that we're focusing on the tail of the serpent and looking at like where the tail is going and saying it doesn't seem to be leading to anything that's a problem. And then we don't really get that there's this kind of crazy straw downstream incalculable set of effects, where the snake biting us really does in some sense derive from things that are very hard for us to factor into our immediate judgments of what is good for us and what is bad for us. And that's true because of many things. Some of them have to do with how whole societies get transformed when the norms obeyed by everyone are slightly altered. And so it maybe is like any one person could do something, some sort of avera, and it's maybe mostly not causing tremendous harm. But when you make that a new norm in a society, then it's like turning the thermostat up on an ice statue and the whole thing comes apart. And so there's that kind of thing, and that has an inverse dimension as well for positive mitzvot and doing the right thing. And then we see that from Chazal over and over again, right? Like there are many respects in which Chazal try to illustrate for us that we also can't appreciate, the positive consequences. Like we may have touched before on this Gemara, where there's this Jew named Yosef who's very makpid about keeping Shabbat, and some astrologers in Bavel or whatever tell his neighbor, who's this goy who's very rich, that all of your wealth is gonna, become the possession of Yosef, the Jew, and the goy is very disturbed by this, and so he takes all of his wealth and sells all his property and uses it to buy this giant pearl of tremendous value, and he just keeps the pearl in his hat so that it can never fall into the hands of the Jew. And then one day he's walking over a bridge, and a gust of wind blows his hat off the bridge into the water, and a fish swallows the pearl, and a fisherman catches the fish. And who should buy the fish in the market for Kibud Shabbat but Yosef the Jew, who's makpid about giving honor to Shabbat. And he brings it home, cuts open the fish, and now he has the pearl. So that's something. When Chazal tell us about that, they're trying to show to us that exactly like we cannot appreciate how HaKadosh Baruch Hu has tremendous freedom to weave together different sets of events so that he can reward us for our mitzvot and punish us for our avirot. And in addition, there's also the chokhmah that we often don't appreciate about where bracha comes from, right? Like, what does it mean that Hashem blessed the seventh day? We say that when we make Kiddush, when we're reading from this, Vayichu l'shamayim v'aretz v'chol tzava'am, what does it mean? What is the bracha of the seventh day? Before people start keeping Shabbat, you don't really appreciate it. You think, not working for one day, you're going to just have 6/7 as much stuff, right? Because you're creating whatever you're creating, working every day, and now you're just going to have less. But of course, fast forward however many millennia of Jewish history, and we understand, in a way we were talking about last time, that taking some time to lift your eyes from the grindstone, accept the first job that comes along, but you look for one where you can somehow negotiate a better situation for self by having human capital that you've stored up, et cetera, et cetera. And fast forward a few millennia of Jewish history, there's tremendous wealth that actually can be generated from keeping Shabbat. We don't keep it in order to get wealthy, but it now is like a story of sociology and economics and cultural history, whatever, that of course keeping Shabbat and all the demands that imposed on Am Yisrael can lead to bracha. So there's the difficult to anticipate chokhmah of how avirot or mitzvot can benefit you or can harm you. And there's also, in addition, HaKadosh Baruch Hu always stacking the deck however he wants. So if he wants to give you a pearl, be that is the sum total of someone else's wealth, even though that person was hell-bent on keeping it out of your hands, and he wants to do it dafka in the schut of you're trying to keep Shabbat, he can do that, and it's just a flick of the wrist, so to speak, and that will happen as well. So I definitely agree that we need to make room for the idea that Hashem is unlimited in how he acts in the world and history and in our lives, in ways that should focus us on the possibility that our actions have tremendous consequences that we can't appreciate, and we should treat the choices that we make as ones where Borei Olam is watching us and judging us, and that's the frame in which we should actually be deciding how to act. But at the same time, the subtle difference, I think, with mysticism, I don't know whether we're talking Zohar or other kind of Kabbalistic ideas, or the general notion of what you might call a mysticism, the difference there is that tries to take the idea of the significance of what you're doing and turn it instead into an invisible video game that you're playing, which in turn produces the temptation that you can beat the house because it's just a video game, that is actually magic that's subject to your manipulation. And so it's a very subtle and suddenly slippery slope when you shift the weight to the other foot. And instead of saying, let's tell people Hashem is watching and he's judging our actions and he cares about everything that we're doing and all of the mitzvot, and it's not beyond him to show that. But once you start saying, when you do this mitzvah, it produces this emanation in the spiritual realm, which interacts with this other emanation in the spiritual realm that's produced by this other thing. And then they combine and then they produce this, which goes over here. And when people actually are attracted to that sort of pseudoscience of spirituality, because that's how Avodah Zarah works. And they are attracted to and drawn onward by that way of talking, precisely because it submits itself as a reductive mechanism where you speak and not really think anymore about Hashem's judgment, but just he's given you the code book and now you can play the video game to your advantage. And that happens over and over again once people get on the road to real mysticism. And I think you see that unfortunately all over the place today in how people substitute Kabbalistic ideas for the mitzvot themselves, and for real relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which should be one much more full of yirah before his judgment. But once it becomes this kind of form of witchcraft in a sense, because it's more kind of like tooled in your hands, then you can kind of push him out of the picture and focus on the klipot or focus on the, sigulot or sfirot or whatever else, and just kind of mix your potion.
So what's interesting is maybe a suggestion could be taking some of the ideas of Rav Chaim Volozhin and preserving them, but in a general sense, and the key being not to get into too many specifics. Like sort of like keep a general sense that what I'm doing might be having this, although that was the word, cosmic significance, while at the same time not getting involved with the specificity that you described.
Yeah, I think the problem is the being explicit about the backstory in a way that it's supposed to have generality to it, so it becomes its own kind of a science that you're supposed to be able to learn and then turn to your will, because science always ultimately is about mastery of nature, like a reproducible craft that enables you to do something whether you deserve to be able to do it or not. And I think we just see that all over the place in the examples that Hazal give us of how to think about this. They give us many different kinds of stories that are told in the Midrash, in the Gemara, like in sort of the Agadata parts of Gemara, like the one we just told about, the pearl and the fish and everything, where they constantly are trying to push us into a view of the world that frames things in such a way that we see Hashem as the author of events, and where his judgment and our inclination towards him and towards mitzvot and all of that are the things that matter. And I think the difference between that and what you would call mysticism is that Chazal don't explain, in a sense, what the mechanistic connection is between Yosef, the Jew, keeping Shabbat and what happens with the pearl afterwards, as though there's some kind of physics that connects them, that has a demonic spiritual kind of composition that can really be described in detail. It's just a story of these are the set of events. This is what happened. And it's clear as day in the way the story is constructed as a whole that the meaning of the story does have to do with the mitzvot and the zchut and the relationship of the person to Hashem, because again, Yosef the Jew is not keeping Shabbat in order to get fish pearls from his Sabbath meal, right? Like it wasn't a get rich quick scheme. I'll just keep Shabbat forever and ever and ever, and eventually wealth will fall into my lap because I'm keeping Shabbat, and I'll just like cut open the fish every week and see if there's a pearl there. In all of these accounts, the sincerity of the person involved is a key element, where Akadosh Baruch Hu sees that the person keeping the mitzvot is doing it to have a relationship with him and to serve him according to his Torah, and doing that with a pure heart. And then, of course, there's all sorts of reward that comes with that. But the moment it starts being, I want the reward, it gets much more fraught and complicated. I'm thinking now about, this Gemara about Gimzo, who was the teacher of, I think, Rabbi Akiva, right? And he was called Gimzo because he always said Gamzo Tova. Like this is also for the good. And story is told about how he was tested in this way where people sent him to deliver the tax money from Eretz Yisrael to the Romans. So they gave him this big box of money to bring to the Romans. And then when he was staying in an inn overnight, they broke into his room and dug up the floor of the inn and took the dirt and just filled the box with dirt and took the money away. So then he carried the box of dirt all the way to Rome and presented it to the emperor. When they opened the box, there was no money in it. And that, of course, put him in a tight spot because it seemed like he had done something else with all the tax money that was due to Rome. And then he says, Gamzo leTorah, and he quotes a pasuk, I forget, maybe from, Yeshayahu or Yirmiyahu or Yechezkel, I think maybe Yechezkel, about like the dust of the earth being, your soldiers, I don't remember the exact pasuk, are fighting for you. And he says, take this dust and throw it at your enemies in battle and you'll be victorious. And the emperor takes it to battle and they throw it and they're victorious. So he says, whoa, okay, I want more of this magic dirt. And the people who played this trick on Gimzo step in to try to provide it, and they like go to the inn and dig up more of the dirt there and bring it to the emperor, and he takes it into battle and it doesn't work, and now they're the ones in the tight spot because they couldn't deliver. And around, I mean, there's so many versions of this in Chazal. It's the same kind of concept, like also what Haran, the brother of Avram, who said, oh, if Avram burns up in the oven, then I'll go with Nimrod, and if Avram is saved, I'll go with Hashem, and Avram is saved. And so now Haran thinks, okay, so it seems like Hashem is more powerful than Nimrod, so now I'll side with Hashem. And then Nimrod says, cast Haran into the oven, and Haran is burnt up, right? Because he had based his faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu on a law that he could make nisim. So it's the sincerity of the Oved Hashem is a key ingredient in all of this, and that interestingly makes it impossible for there to be a mystical science, or let's say mystical science, or a mysticism behind all of this that works, because there's no point in talking about I mean, you can make up a science that says, oh, well, like the mystical realm only responds properly to people with pure kavanah, or with the right intention, but there's no meaning or sense to talking about a world that is made up of a backstory that cannot produce causes that are predictable or reliable, in a way that you can sort of empirically repeat. That doesn't, there's no substance to such a reality that can be probed and interacted with. It's not the way we talk about the world. When we say there's a chair over there, the reason there's a chair over there is because I can do things with the chair that are predictable and reliable, that those words pick out. But I think what's always evasive and elusive about the mystical description is it's always it's always sliding away from you can actually pin it down and say, now I know that this should happen because that happened. And that's actually what people only want from it. Like it turns into sorcery over and over again, because what people actually want is something that's just reliable science in their hands to use divine magic to do what they want. And the moment you add the additional restriction on it that, oh, it only actually does any of these things that we say that it's doing if it, has to do with if it derives from the sincerity of the people doing the mitzvot or whatever else, then why are we even talking about it? Why don't we just tell a story about a tzaddik who did the right thing and Hashem rewarded him, as Chazal do, where we can see the meaning of how Hashem shows his hand in the world, but we don't need to concern ourselves with some notion of mechanism in a spiritual realm where Hashem's authorship is somehow reduced to a dualistic physics that exists in a different plane.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.